Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion focused on Chapter 253, Township of Tom Rivers Ordinances. Specifically, this panel is about the new Municipal Certificate of Continued Use and Occupancy, or as we're just going to refer to it today, the new CO ordinance that's in place. Today's panel discussion is focused on both listening to the town and educating you, our members, on what the ordinance is and what some of the implications of this ordinance are to you as you practice real estate in Toms River. So hopefully we'll be able to introduce it, unpack it, and discuss this ordinance in a really orderly fashion. I want to thank each of you who submitted questions as you registered for this event. A number of our members have asked some really solid questions. We've taken those, compiled them into categories, and we'll be asking those questions on your behalf. And if we need to, we'll also do a follow-up meeting to this as well. Now, there'll also be some follow-up communications coming from the association, so you should be watching for those. Links on the website to the various links from the city to the ordinance itself, to some of the forms that you'll need in the future will all be available to you through your membership portal on the Monmouth Ocean Regional Realtors website. Today, we are not here for debate of the validity of this ordinance or really even to discuss that. It's important to know that Monmouth Ocean Regional Realtors, along with our friends and our partners at the New Jersey Realtors, are still working behind the scenes on this ordinance. We have some significant areas of concern, as many of you has expressed. And it's our hope that we will see some kind of means of addressing some of those in the very near future. But today, that conversation is different. What I encourage each of you joining us today is to understand that this ordinance has been passed by the township, and it will take effect on all properties which have an ownership interest being transferred on or after July 1st of 2022. So if you practice real estate in Toms River, you need to be prepared to serve your clients in conjunction and collaboration with this ordinance. So again, at the conclusion of this webinar, each registered person will be sent a survey for us to gather your follow-up questions. A copy of this webinar's recording will be posted on our website, and our association will work to help gain questions, gain answers, and if we need to, hold a subsequent panel discussion for your benefit. Now, to that end, our panel is here to help you understand the ordinance and to begin thinking about how it's going to take effect and how it's going to affect the way you and your clients engage in real estate in Toms River. So I'm joined today by a very knowledgeable and involved group of individuals, and I'd like to introduce them to you if I could. First, I'd like to introduce to you Craig Ambrosio, Craig's a longtime employee of the Township of Toms River. He currently serves as the Division Manager of Housing and Code Enforcement. Craig, welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Stan Ferlio, Stan, and I know I said that wrong. You have to excuse the Texan in me still. I have a hard time with my own name. Stan is the Code Enforcement Supervisor for the town of Toms River. Stan, thank you also for joining us today. I'd like to introduce Jim Jorman. Jim is a longtime member of the Monmouth Ocean Regional Realtors, practicing real estate agent and broker. He serves on our board of directors and is the managing broker of Caldwell Banker Riviera Realty. They have 6 offices in Ocean County, one of which is right here in Toms River. Jim, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Jeanette Schaeffler is with us. Jeanette also is a very engaged member of our association. She serves on numerous committees and is a director of our board of directors. She's also the managing broker for Crossroads Realty right here in Toms River. Jeanette, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And of course, we have Mike Little. And for those of you who know Mike, know that Mike has lived his entire life in Toms River. He's not only grown up and gone to school there, but owns businesses inside of Toms River, is actively involved in the community, and is the broker owner of Keller Williams Shore Property. Mike, thank you very much and for being here and joining us today.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Craig and Stan.
So our format's going to be fairly straightforward. Craig, I'm going to open up questions about the provisions in this ordinance with the intent of bringing understanding to how it is going to be implemented. As our guest, you're going to be given the priority to answer or opine on any of the questions you want. We intend on treating you with the most respect and honor that you and the township deserve. Jim, Jeanette, Mike, I want to invite you, of course, to each make your own observations along the way, specifically about areas where you believe our members or our consumers really should take note. Each one of you are seasoned professionals. You all have reputations for doing the right things. And so we trust that you'll help lead that discussion in such a manner. When you have a comment or a question about the implementation of Chapter 253, I invite you just to interject. And of course, I'll do my best to moderate and to keep us to our time allotment. With that said, Craig, I want to start with you, and I want to just give you the opportunity to introduce this ordinance from the town's perspective, as well as give our audience some background into it.
Thank you again. What transpired about 5 years ago, the governing body at that time and the administration had pondered a CCO. Ever since they've been pondering it, working it through, they charged me with trying to find out the ins and outs of some of the things that we should expect and how we can implement it. And that brought us to here today. We have a passed ordinance that will be implemented July 1st, as you said, and we intend to work with your organization and the rest of the professionals in the real estate industry or that serve the real estate industry to make this happen. So anything you have for me, fire away.
All right, thank you very much. So with that said, I want to just dive into and take this from a kind of a question and answer standpoint over well. Now, those of you who have joined us on the webinar, in the chat, you will find the link to the ordinance itself. If you want to read or follow along, we will reference specific portions of that ordinance. It is not lengthy. I believe it's 6 pages maybe in total for that ordinance, but it is packed full of changes. Craig or Stan, chapter 253, 1A overlays this ordinance on all residential properties that are, quote, sold, resold, and or transferred inside the township. Can you start by clarifying for our members which properties are actually subject to this ordinance? Is it specifically single family? Is it duplex residential, triplex, quadplex, condos, apartments, hotels that have occupancy of more than 30 days or longer, vacation rentals? What is the town's intent on the residential property criteria?
Any residence. Hotels would fall under the DCA as a completely different category. Whether you're renting it out through our rental program or whether you're living in it yourself, it's still required to have a CCO.
Okay. And so then that begs a second question: is the term transferred is a kind of a loose term, and it did not have a definition inside of the ordinance. So does the term transfer also refer to rental properties that transition from one occupant to another occupant, or is it specifically to the transfer of the ownership of an investment property? In other words, if I own a property and I sell it, I'm aware we have to get a CO. But what about between the rentals, like when a vacancy happens and it transfers to a new tenant?
Those are already covered under a separate ordinance. We already have a rental CO program in place. It's been in place for 35 years.
So to be clear, the existing ordinance is still going to govern rental properties except when they transition ownership hands, correct?
Oh, exactly.
Good. Mike, Jeanette, James, Jim, you have anything?
No.
Nope, understandable.
Good. So chapter 253, section 6A lists 3 kind of conditions that can be met to be granted an exception to the mandate CO. And I understand all 3 conditions actually have to be met to grant the exception. Can you provide a little bit of, Craig, provide a little clarity to 6A and maybe even give us some possible examples where the township believes that this exception may be used?
I believe there's really only one requirement, is that it actually apply and you're transferring ownership without occupancy. The affidavit that would need to be signed will be provided by the township. It's only in draft form at this moment. It's simply saying, without all the legalese, it simply says the buyer and the seller understand that it's being a transfer of title only, and it will not be occupied until all the criteria to obtain an MCCUO is achieved.
So how would that apply in the case in Toms River, for example? We have a number of families that we know of that occupy single family residence, but they're multiple generations inside the same house. Perhaps the house is titled in the name of the parents, but the children still live with them. And they begin the process of transferring the title to the children, from the parents to the children, without vacating occupancy. In that type of transfer, will they have to have all of the CO requirements met?
Not the township attorney, so I wouldn't exactly hold me to this, but my understanding would be that anytime you transfer title, whether it's to your daughter, your son, to your mother, it's treated exactly the same in the industry. Title change occurs, and that would still require the MCCUO.
Okay, so we appreciate clarity on that. That's a question that we've been asked a number of times about this. Is it really, as we all know, in Toms River, there is a significant portion of the populace that does have this kind of multiple generations living, in fact, across the country. This is a good time to say, by the way, to all of those listening, that Craig, Stan, myself, Jim, Jeanette, Mike, none of us are licensed to practice law in the state of New Jersey. And so therefore, don't take anything that we're offering you today as legal advice. We're simply trying to help you unpack and understand what these implications are.
Brian, can I take you back on that for a second, please?
Yeah, of course, Mike, go ahead.
Hi, Craig, how are you?
Very good. Happy birthday, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. It's my brother's birthday too. Did you know that? Yeah. Sorry. Based on that too, I just had a question about if there was an estate, the husband and wife, the husband passes away, they are going to be actually, transferring title from an estate maybe to the spouse. And in that case, I'm wondering if a partial transfer or something is considered a transfer of title. It will be a new deed, but just didn't know how the town would handle that, because we handle a lot of that in adult communities, as you might know, and we handle some of that real estate.
I would have to defer to your individual lawyers or the surrogate,
Okay, thank you.
those transfers.
Good. So in the past 12 months, Craig, our agents here in Monmouth Ocean, at least, in 12 months, we reported 2,124 properties that closed or transferred title that we know of inside the township. About $1 billion in transactions in Toms River alone. In February of last year, we had 105 residential properties transition. In our system today, that number is actually doubled. We have 223 pending sales in Toms River for the month of February right now. In peaks in months such as like August, there's over 200 homes a month. So Craig, or maybe Stan, this may be even a better question for you. What steps has the city implemented to account for the staffing and the infrastructure requirements to implement and manage this new CO, to be able to handle, roughly 400, 450 inspections and re-inspections a month?
Our estimate's a little bit higher than yours,
Okay.
based upon our tax collectors and tax assessors. We have about roughly 3,100 last year. So that's what we've geared up, and we're staffing up to go and handle, both clerically and inspector-wise.
Yeah. What does that kind of look like? Help our members understand what that kind of looks like. How many more people, like how many inspectors is that? How many clerical staff? Or is there a number that's determined yet by the township?
There isn't a number that's determined, because we will be utilizing existing and new inspectors. So for instance, any inspector will be able to handle whether it's a code enforcement call, a rental CO, or the MCCUO. So there's not going to be any dedicated people that only do the real estate transfer of title.
Yeah, And I appreciate you making that point. I think that's important for our members to know is that it's not a dedicated person. So when they go on vacation, it doesn't mean that the number of inspection that goes is going to go down because of staffing. That the township is taking appropriate steps to cross-train its professionals to be able to manage the load of the consumer that's trying to make this real estate transition.
It's going to mirror, for those of you that are familiar with our rental CO program, it's going to mirror that in many ways. Much more downgraded. We're not coming near as close to the criteria for a transfer sale or an MCCUO. It will then be the same inspectors doing the same types of things for the site inspection.
Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
Thank you, Brian. I'd just like to go back to that title of transfer of title affidavit that Craig mentioned. I fear that some of our people watching this may be scratching their heads saying, just what is that? I believe that many of you will see that as very similar to that as a conditional CO. Would that be correct, Craig? Is that what we used to call a conditional CO? But it's where somebody cannot signs an affidavit that they cannot live it or occupy the premises. Is that correct?
Yes, I would not categorize it that, and our law department specifically had said not to categorize it as a temporary CO. It's basically saying that both the seller agrees that they're selling a property that is not occupiable according to the standards of the MCCUO, and the buyer in turn is acknowledging that they understand that also, and will not and shall not occupy the property until it meets the requirements and they've obtained an MCCUO.
Okay, and what our membership needs to understand is that this affidavit will be provided by the township, and that the seller will have to sign that affidavit and pay that fee to the township. Is that correct?
That is correct. It'll be in a PDF format with categories to fill in, who's involved, and with almost any other affidavit, it's signed by all parties involved. What we don't want to have happen is the seller saying, "Oh, we're selling this just as a transfer of title," and have an unknowing or unwitting buyer come to us a year from now. Well, we didn't know that there was open permits. We didn't know that there was no water on in the property. We didn't know all of the things that were needed. So this is really mostly for us to make sure that the buyer knows what they're getting into and what their obligation is going to be.
Jeanette, go ahead. I see you had your hand up.
Yes, I have a couple questions because now everything's spinning. If a buyer decides to buy it, we have many people that purchase as is. So and I understand that they can purchase it as is, as long as everything is done 21 days prior to closing. But are they allowed to start work on it before that? And like after they file the paperwork, before they own it, can they start the repair process so that they don't have to wait another month or so to get moved in?
Let me try and answer. I want to try and steer away from what my personal answer would be from what that would be. Whatever they work out with the seller and agreements for occupancy and so on, and as long as there's permits that are pulled to do the work, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be able to do that.
So the purchaser can pull the permits before they own the property, or they have to be pulled by the seller?
The purchaser would have to do it with the seller's permission.
Okay.
And that would probably be part of what you guys may have used in the past, where you got an early occupancy agreements and so on. That would probably be of a similar type of thing, what I'm envisioning what you're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
So when we talk about the impact of this to the consumer, by the way, to that very point on title, to the consumer and to the real estate agent, it's important to know that the township has made it possible for the property to transfer without it being brought up to code. But for that to happen, if I understand this correctly, both the buyer and the seller have to agree that the seller is taking on that responsibility, that they will not be able to occupy that property until all of the inspections have been passed and the house has kind of been certified for this. So, in an example of an estate home, they may sell it as is, and they may have some kind of criteria that says, we'll sign this affidavit. If you sign this affidavit, you're buying it just as it is. You can't live in it. The responsibility of getting this CO done is on you, the buyer. Craig, is that kind of?
But I think you mixed up the two in the beginning. It's definitely the buyer or the current owner who receives the property. They are the ones that are obligated to meet the requirements. In some ways, it really takes the seller off the hook for having to do anything or for them to come back on them about any of those.
Yeah, if the affidavit is signed. Otherwise, before the seller can sell the home, they have to have met that criteria. So that what the takeaway really needs to become is that this becomes a point of negotiation for our brokers and our agents when they're representing clients. How a property or when a property and what level of this is going to happen prior to the actual closing becomes this negotiated point. And that's probably going to be different if it's a bank-owned property versus if it's an individual selling their house, right? And how that's dealt with. And so the takeaway from that is to be very familiar with what this particular, the exception section of this ordinance looks like, and develop inside of your brokerage firms and inside of your practice what the policy, what the protocol is going to be, depending on whether you're representing a buyer and seller so that you can get through this takeaway. Mike, Jim, Jeanette, does that sound like the kind of like the package that we're looking at?
Yes, but because I can't help myself, I want to add one more thing to it. Is
Yeah,
there a time frame then for the buyer that they have to be done? If the buyer commits and says, I'm the one that's going to do everything, is there a time frame that they have to finish everything, or can it be open-ended for a year or 2 years?
It could be open-ended as long as they do not attempt to occupy or have anybody else occupy the home.
Okay,
Now, to this, because this question came earlier today, that doesn't mean they're exempt from the normal rules of permit processing and property maintenance, for instance. If somebody, and I'm going to make up a hypothetical situation, we have a house that's going to be torn down, and at some point in time, a new property is put on it. At the time of transfer of title, the house is secure. Some point during time, that changes. Somebody breaks out all the windows. It becomes occupied by infestation of whatever. They still have to meet the township's requirements for minimal property maintenance. Otherwise, but the transfer can remain in effect virtually indefinitely as long as they don't try to habitate.
okay, thank you.
all right, we're going to move. Go ahead.
Let me get the origin behind this exception was in no way do we want to hamper commerce and the transfer of ownership, because we know that's how things get fixed up, rebuilt, improved, and put back on the occupied roles for our residents. So we wanted this to be able to be there, a way for that to occur and not stand in the way with our individual regulations.
Yeah. Thank you for giving us that background, Craig. I'm going to move us forward a little bit. I want to talk about section 2A of chapter 253 for a minute. And in that, it creates a time of 30 days prior to an anticipated close date from the receipt of an application before a property can close. In other words, the application has to be made or is intended to be made 30 days prior to an anticipated close date. And so as I read the ordinance and tried to wrap my head around the timeline and what the real implication of this is, I went to the best case scenario. The best case scenario says that from the application time, there's 7 days for the city to inspect it, 5 additional days for the city to render a report after that. And if the property passes all of the requirements, then 2 days, the city issues a CO. So if I read that right, it reads like the process could take as little as 14 days. Is that correct?
No.
Okay, Help me.
One, let's go ahead and take the exception portion out of the timeline we're discussing.
correct.
That's only in reference to the MCCUOs. So 30 days prior to anticipated closing is when we'd like you to make the application. We then have time to receive your different documents, clarify the documents, start to do our checks internally for outstanding permit, whatever it happens to be. Then we schedule the inspection. Once that's done, once we schedule the inspection, we have 7 days to go ahead and provide you a copy. Once all criteria is met, to go ahead and provide you that certificate, or in the case of the exception, a letter and receipt acknowledging the receipt of a completed acceptable affidavit. Is that clear? So you're possibly right if we have no other issues. In a perfect world, if somebody walks in with every document with the application and we have no other circumstances, there is a possibility of something between 15 and 25 days, yes. But it's not really, that's not going to be the real norm.
So
Now,
Craig,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. So as far as an Oprah request, is that the responsibility now of the person responsible for getting the CO to obtain all the information or open permits? Or is that the township's responsibility once the application is submitted?
Once the application is submitted, our internal staff, clerical staff will be checking what we have internal different programs. SDL will be checking with engineering, we'll be checking with zoning, we'll be checking with the tax collector. Okay, on all of those items. If all of those are clear, there's no need, even though I still would recommend that anybody do their own diligence to go ahead and check for these things. We are doing it internally to go ahead and say, hey, there's outstanding issues or not. So in order, we have to be clear on that.
All right,
So
thank
are
you. Craig.
Is
And
the
there's
city?
no, I'm sorry, Brian.
No,
Is
Mike,
there-
please, go
is
ahead.
there, so then is there any time frame that the township has to do their investigation once they receive an application? So hypothetically, if we do submit an application prior to the 30 days and the township receives it, it could be open-ended on how long that checks and balances could take before the 7 days starts to schedule an inspection. Is that correct?
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe that that's the way it's going to go. If you guys, and I'm sure most of you have dealt with this, this is going to be no less than our rental COs. This
Got
is
it.
gonna be
Okay.
no less. So we are staffing accordingly. We are going to make sure that this goes as smoothly as possible to go and expedite, because nobody knows more than us that these things need to sell. They need to sell. You guys need to sell. New people need to move in. We need to move on with this. Where our biggest hangup is probably going to be, if you guys are wondering where this is going to be, is old permits that are unclosed or incompleted or unresolved. That's where our logjam is going to be.
Got it.
It's relying on the seller or his agent, and I don't mean real estate agents, the seller or his agent. That could be an executor, that could be anybody that goes ahead and finds out, hey, there wasn't a permit to put these 5 bedrooms on the back of the house, and now you have to go ahead and make them available and complete. Our building department has been doing this for years with us on some of the rental stuff. They know it. They legitimize these things regularly. Anybody that knows, and I think you might know too, Mike, the DCA controls what our building department can and can't do and what they can. They can't necessarily come in. There's exceptions, but for the most part, they're not going to say, come in and tear down the sheetrock in the basement because we want to see the wiring. They can't come in and say, we got to go ahead and do this. These are really legitimizing what's been done, because these people that own this house may have never even known that this wasn't done from the original construction. So we're going to try to accommodate them as best we can, but it's going to be on the seller or his agent to be doing that work with the individual departments. So if there's an outstanding issue with zoning or an outstanding issue with building, the owner or their representative will have to be, we're not doing the internal work to rectify it. if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. Very clear.
Hey,
Craig, Craig, I'd like to also just talk a little bit about this 30-day prior timeline to make sure everybody understands it, and some of the challenges we and sellers and buyers are going to face with this. So we are going to, the seller is going to have to submit this application for CO 30 days ahead of time, and it must be signed by the buyer as well. Is that correct?
No, I'm sorry, that's only for the exception. Nothing needs to be signed by a buyer unless they're going through the exception route. So for instance, the moment they decide to list with you, and that doesn't mean they're not going to sell it the very next day, because I know how terrific real estate agents you guys are, and you may sell it the next day. But
All of my agents sell more, Craig. I just want you to know, they all sell
All
more.
right.
so what happens is the owner, when he's contemplating buying or selling, I should say, or you're working with, that application could start immediately unless he's trying to go the route or chooses to go the route of the exception. That will
All right.
require a buyer's name and
All right.
their
Right. My understanding is the application just has to have the buyer's name on it if known.
The buyer's
If
name.
done, Craig.
All right.
And
All right.
So let
The-
me, oh, gentlemen, sorry, go ahead.
Let
Go
me
right ahead,
finish
Jim.
with this if I may. Okay, so now with the inspection, we have to have the certificates, i.e. Heating certificate, and some of the certificates for chimney and some of the things like that for the inspection. That's correct, right?
let me answer one thing that we're not gonna require the buyer's name if you're not doing the route of exception. Mike, I'm sorry if you got that impression. We are only asking for the MCC. I don't want to say we don't care who the buyer is, but you don't need to have a buyer. It's not going to be our criteria that we need to know the buyer's name. That stems from maybe something on the rental side, not on the sale side.
Oh,
Now,
sorry,
there's
that's what I was just reading. It was 253-2C. It said on the application form, the applicant must provide a telephone number, street address for service and purpose, post office. The application form must also identify the prospective buyer if known.
Yeah, and that's real. That's not going to be one of our criteria.
Okay.
Slow down anything. That shouldn't
Got
be. Because, well, what if I don't have, it shouldn't be a word.
Especially since that change.
Got it. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And so, Jim, I'm going to say your question, actually, we're going to deal with, wrap that into another question.
All right.
And I want to clarify something. We've gotten several questions coming through the chat. So I want everybody to know in the webinar that we're categorizing your questions when they come in. Some of them are already encompassed in the questions we're asking. Others are going to be, will be dealt with later as time permits. I do want to, as we talk about this, and we're going to talk about section 3A now, which is the other requirements for inspections and what has to be brought in. So let's be very clear that this ordinance stands alone. So fire inspections, that is still the protocol. You still have to have that done in the township. This does not replace any other existing inspections that were already or requirements already in place. Likewise, this does not change the material defect nature of a property that was there. So if you have a property that was damaged by a storm, and let's say the roof got blown off and somebody put a new roof on it and they never pulled a permit for that, that does not change that. You still have to deal with that in the same way that you always have. It'll have to be inspected. It'll have to be certified. If the electric wiring of a basement was finished out and permits were never pulled, you still have to deal with that kind of material defect. This code is really intended to deal with this transfer of property and evaluating those things and making sure that they were done correctly. So it doesn't override that. Now, section 3A talks specifically about some inspections that have to be done. There's, I believe, a furnace inspection, a well water inspection if there's well water, a fireplace or chimney or wood burning stove, issues around the pool and electricity, heating tanks, things that we look for in other counties and other municipalities that we're now looking for in Toms River as well. The ordinance, however, Craig, it does not give a time frame for which those inspections should have occurred, meaning that they could have, in theory, occurred in the day before the application was made, or it could have occurred a year before the application was made, unless there's some other state regulation, requiring how often they have to be inspected. They just, according to this ordinance, they simply have to be submitted. So I guess kind of to package some questions together, what should applicants expect the evaluation process and the criteria for those inspections to be? What's that going to look at? What's the city going to look at in the documents that are turned into them?
Very good question. I would say that the intent and what has been accepted on our rental will be part of that same standard. For instance, property maintenance, which is still part of our standards too. If most, if not all, heating systems and forced air systems that we boil are required to be maintained, and that's usually done on an annual basis. We will accept anything within the year that goes ahead and is acceptable. So for instance, if somebody has their maintenance agreement with XYZ HVAC company and they've done their annual check and then they provide a certification, we're fine.
Okay. All right. So then,
Does that answer the whole question?
I don't know that it actually does. So I guess the question is, how will our members, if my realtor members here are representing somebody purchasing a home or selling a home that is going through this inspection process, what time frame on each of these different inspections is the standard based on? Where can they find that time frame? I mean, where can they go to find black print on white paper that says the furnace inspection has to have been inside the last 12 months, or the electrical inspection for the pool has to be inside the last 3 years? Where do they find that data at? Because I think that's going to become one of the big questions that we have.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be on our application explaining what the time frame is. And I just implied that it's within a year. I think
Okay.
that's a acceptable item since all manufacturers are going to require that type of maintenance annually.
Okay. All right, good.
Now,
So,
let me elaborate on that a little bit more, because we're going to accept, for the heat particular, we're going to accept anything from an HVAC company. We're going to accept anything from a plumbing, licensed plumbing contractor. We're going to accept anything from a home inspector. Those are 3 items. And if somebody presents something, we don't know of any other exceptions or other acceptable ones, but those are the 3 standards.
okay. So to that point, if a licensed home inspector from the state of New Jersey inspects a property subject, prior to the sale, a seller's getting ready to sell the home, they say, you know what, let's go ahead and have a pre-buy inspection done. And they hire a licensed inspector to do that, a home inspector. Can the inspector then look at these items that are called out for these individual inspections, the HVAC, the well water, the pool, those the electricity, the plumbing, and chimney, and document those inside of their home inspection? Will that satisfy the town's requirement?
No, not for all. For the furnace, I would, and they have to allude, they just can't say the furnace was operational. They have to say that they accept responsibility for that. As it relates to the other items, they are specifically exempt in the state of New Jersey as requirements for a home inspector to go in and evaluate. Home
Okay.
inspectors not evaluate internal components of a chimney. He's not required to evaluate well water. He's not required to evaluate pools. He's not required to evaluate any of those items.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is there are a number of inspectors who are certified to inspect all of those things, and they provide that as part of their service. And so when they do one home inspection, they may do those multiple inspections well. Would that inspection report satisfy the criterion? I think what we're hearing is maybe at this point in time, we don't know. We need to see what the application says for the time frame and the requirement for each of those inspections.
As it relates to some of the things you had implied, I believe the only one we're accepting from a home inspector is the furnace.
Okay.
Unless this home inspector is a licensed electrician, it's a whole different story as it relates to some of the other items. But it would have to be something that supports the product.
So that opens up another question around this section 3, which is that, arguably in the state of New Jersey as a whole, there is a massive void of licensed and or qualified inspectors. There is a shortage. how is the township going to assist applicants with locating and contracting these professionals that can meet the requirement?
The town is not going to be doing anything to encourage more HVAC contractors, if that's what you're asking.
Well, I'm asking if, so if now another 2,200 homes, or to use your number, 3,000 homes, 300 a month transfer title, and they all have to have this inspection done, and there's not that many inspectors who can do it. Is the town going to kind of create a resource, a clearing block where the consumer, the seller of the property or the buyer of the property can go and find comprehensive lists of qualified inspectors, people who work inside the town, anything like that? Is the town going to provide some type of a resource to connect these inspectors to these properties?
One, hence the estimated 30-day in advance. And two, we would not be recommending any professionals in any way.
So go ahead, Jeanette.
Are the forms online or do we have to go downtown to pick everything up?
Will be
They
online.
will be online. They're not completed as of yet.
Okay, thank you.
And do I understand the target date for them to be online is June 1st? Do I understand that?
Target date will be a minimum of June 1st.
Okay, all right, good. All right, so section 253 2B really does reply to some of our real estate agents, and that has to do with who can actually make this application, right? And that indicates that the owner or an authorized seller of the property is the person who may apply for the CO. And it further allows someone with legal authority to act on behalf of the entity, on behalf of, the owner of that property. I guess a couple of questions that we run into. First off, how is the town going to determine that legal authority? So can an example, can a homeowner grant legal authority to an agent to make this application for them? Not that we think our brokers would want them to necessarily, but could they do that? And if so, what would that legal authority look like to the town?
Anything that gives legal authority to represent the sellers, we're going to go ahead and accept. So for instance, if your clients, when you're signing them up for a sale, say, hey, I'd like to have the authority to do this, this, and this, and they sign that and you present that or represent that, we're going to go ahead and accept that.
Will there be any kind of promulgated form from the city that can be signed?
Other than that affidavit for the exception, that's going to be the owner or a really, yeah. So
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
there will not be a thing that can be signed.
Could there be?
Doesn't mean it can't. So it's uniform. I don't have any objection to that. I just didn't want to add any more papers for you guys to add to your list to have the sellers sign for you.
Well, it would, so from a mutual feedback perspective, which we could talk about offline as well, it would not be a bad thing if the town promulgated a form that a seller of a property, owner of a property could utilize to grant that legal authority. That's a readily recognizable form. In example, we have forms ourselves, but we don't require our members to use our forms. They can use whatever forms they want, but we still provide it so that they have access to that tool. And so that might be a real benefit to the homeowners, property owners in Towns River to have access to that if they so want to give that authority.
I'll ask law about that. I'll
What
inquire
about-
law. They're okay with that.
Yeah, talk to us for a minute about the case of bank-owned and foreclosed properties. How will the town work to communicate with the banks themselves about these requirements?
For the bank-owned properties, there's usually going to be a listing or selling agent.
So in many cases, there are, and we'd like to think that that's a nice, smooth, easy process. Large corporations and conglomerates oftentimes contrive their own rules, plans, and create their own black and white, and it bogs the systems everywhere. Does the town have any tools in place, any resources in place to help the agents or help the homeowners or the property owners perhaps that are in foreclosure to work with the banks on meeting the town's requirements?
As of yet, I have no knowledge of that, nor do I hear of any knowledge of that. That's going to be up against the agent to go negotiate, similar to right now. When you have a buyer, somebody's talking to the bank, correct? One of your agents or representative or current occupant, it's not going to be us.
There's some bank-owned properties in town that the banks actually rent out. And we communicate fairly clearly with the bank's representatives as far as what needs to be addressed, as far as, if it needs smoke alarms or if it needs new floors. And based on my experience, some of these rental properties, for example, US Bank has rental properties in town, and they contract a third party to represent them and coordinate efforts on their behalf. So maybe it would be something along those lines. We have a relatively good communication process with these companies, and majority of the big banks that have interest in town.
Okay. Mike, Jeanette, Jim, talk a minute about that, because bank-owned properties, probably 15% of the transactions have some involvement in that area, that pocket of Ocean County with a mortgage lender or a bank. How do you think it's going to affect your agents trying to conduct those transactions?
Historically, I know that it's been my experience, my agents always tell me that they have a difficult time getting banks to sign anything, even lead paint disclosure. They just feel they're above it. So it's gonna absolutely pose some challenges to the community in order to get that done. I would hope that sometime in the future that the township would consider the agency relationship that a listing agent has with the owner and accept that as authority to request a CO. That would be my hope. Sometime in the future you do that.
Many times with the bank owned, it says right in the listing agreement that the CO is the responsibility of the buyer. So potentially, if that's already written in there, the township would allow that, maybe another form that the listing agent can sign, and then the buyer already knows that when they go in to make that purchase, that it's their responsibility.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, though, the real estate agent that's solicited by or solicited to a bank to list a property, there's an agreement for that service, correct?
Yes.
Okay. At that time, that agreement can be discussed and negotiated in advance.
Not always. Sometimes you're not really even dealing with the person, and they craft their own forms. We have what we have. We have rules we have to follow, and they just don't care.
They have their
So-
own listing agreements they demand everybody use.
Okay.
So so I think the takeaway from this, and Craig, maybe it's even a note that legal could help with as we still struggle with this implementation and this rollout, is that when we're dealing with this exception, the town has a form that they want signed and used. And so the immediate takeaway is if you're working with bank-owned properties, you need to obtain that form, and the bank must sign that form if they're making the buyer responsible for all the COs, right? And so that's going to have to be held then and then signed also by the buyer. But what may be, Craig, what maybe legal may be able to help assist with is expanding from just that singular form to perhaps the contract for sale or something like that as well on the bank-owned properties, that if the contract for sale has the language in it, that perhaps the town would accept that also.
Well, that would be okay for the that's representative is different than the sale.
So we're talking about both for the representative side, but more particularly for the sales side, is where we think the bottleneck will happen is if the city has a specific form that has to be signed, getting a representative from the city to sign that specific form, or from the bank rather, to sign that specific form is near impossible. It's like a turtle getting on top of a fence post, to use an old politician's term, right? It's gonna have to have help to get up there somehow, because the bank is not going to typically sign any form that is not theirs, even if it is a municipal form. And so there may have to be some accommodation that's worked out that way. And we're glad to work behind the scenes with you on.
I hear what you're saying. Here's the other possibility, though. I would say that we are not open to any other affidavit. However, speaking of a logjam, now these individual affidavits will have to be reviewed by our law department, which may be just as sticky as getting something through the bank, if you will. They're not going to openly say, we'll accept any agreement from banks, because they're all going to be written different, as you had stated, and their own documents. So law would possibly entertain one that's just as good or better, but they're going to now add to the review time for that affidavit portion on the exception.
All right, well, we can discuss that a little further later. Let's move on, because I know we still have several questions to go through, and we have them pouring in, and I want to be as respectful of your time as we possibly can. The township in section chapter 3-2 discusses utilities. In the real property world, utilities is a huge issue. It can, in some definitions, it ranges as little as electricity and water. In others, electricity, water, gas, if it's available. Some definitions include telephone, data cabling, security systems, Wi-Fi, other things like that as utility services. To the township of Toms River, what should our agents expect that the definition of utility contain? Where is the boundary of the utilities that must be present?
The boundary is anything that is required to make it occupiable.
And what would those utilities be?
Such as, it depends on the home. If it's an all electric home, it'd just be electric, water, and sanitary, such sanitary, but those have to be on. If there's gas, to go ahead and have heat and water and hot water, they would all have to be cooking units. They all have to be operational in order to do an inspection. If not, we're going the route of the exception.
Okay. And what about items, what about the external items that are now becoming considered more and more utilities, like Wi-Fi or data cabling, internet? Is that going to be considered? So in an example, we have communities now that are putting in internet services as their only, as an included utility. The town is not, if that existed in Toms River, the town is not going to look at that.
Not at all.
Okay, good. All right. So I want to discuss flat work for just a second, which is subsection 11 of 253-3. And it has language in there about the sidewalks and the driveway aprons. So does that language include public sidewalks? So if there's a deficiency on the public sidewalk, will that have to be cured prior to a CO issued?
Yes.
And so when the discussion arises of whether or not that public sidewalk is the city's responsibility or the homeowner's responsibility, is there an expedited time frame for that to be handled?
The declaration of who owns that is clear by Toms River's position that it is to be maintained by the property owner.
So
That
there
is-
are, yeah, so I don't know in Toms River specifically, but there are properties inside of Ocean County that I'm aware of where the property line actually stops prior to, the physical legal property line stops prior to a city sidewalk. And the city sidewalks are then considered part of the Parks Department, Streets Department. I don't know that that exists inside of Toms River, but I know that's one of the questions that's going to be asked is if the survey indicates that the sidewalk's off from the property, but it's clearly the sidewalk of that property, is there an expedited means of that being rectified, or is that simply going to work through the extended process?
The township's position is that those improvements are the property owner's responsibility.
Okay.
It's
Right.
within the
Brian,
right of way.
can I put that in a different context?
Sure.
What about, for instance, in a condominium, where clearly the property owner and what's being sold, that's common element and not owned and being transferred by the seller? What about in that situation?
In that situation, it's to and from that unit. If from your unit to getting into that unit, it needs to be free of tripping hazards.
So it could then, in effect, if the parking lot was in front of the condo unit, there was a sidewalk leading from the parking lot to the staircase that fed that condo unit, and there was a tripping hazard on that sidewalk, that could hold up the CO process until the community association or whoever fixed that sidewalk.
That is less likely to be our case. However, what you're saying is correct.
What about the case on the aprons? So we noticed that aprons and driveway aprons were included in that. Tom's River has been very good about trying to stay on top of their road maintenance and has made increased efforts in the past year. But those aprons, where they butt up against private driveways that are already in place, are not already, in some instances, we know already that the workmanship of the town has created the apron issue, and there could be a perceived tripping hazard. Is that the same, where the homeowner is going to have to work through that with the city to rectify the city's work first?
Our law department still considers the apron and the sidewalk the owner's responsibility.
So Jim, Mike, Jeanette, I know this is one of these issues that's gonna come up in Tom's River. What do you think your agents need to be telling their clients, their potential sellers of these properties, about these type of issues prior to the listings?
I have a question. If there's a tree and the sidewalk is up because of it, it happens now. They can't really have the work done because you can't get somebody out if the ground is frozen to fix the tree, to do the stuff. Is there a way of, with a regular closing, you can put something in escrow and say, we promise to have it done in a certain time frame. Is there a weather exception?
Let me address your tree portion. That same interpretation of the sidewalks and driveway aprons interprets that tree as the property owner's responsibility.
Right, but if the ground's frozen and they can't get access to get it fixed until a couple months later, can they put money in escrow and promise to have it done and still close?
We do not have anything like that in place, and it probably fall under the exception.
Okay.
In response to your question, Brian, I think that I would advise my agents that they're going to have to take the exterior into consideration when they do their visual inspection of the property, and advise the owner of the township's position on that.
And Brian, I agree with Jim too, because, the ordinance in Tom's River, for as long as I've ever known, even shoveling the sidewalk is responsibility of the homeowner. And that has to be part of the agent's expertise to explain that any repairs have to be done, even if they're in the right of way, and responsibility of adjoining properties owners, right to fix or responsibility to fix.
Good. All right, so I've got one more of our questions that came in before, and then I want to give you each an opportunity to discuss a couple of things. I want to review. I've got a stack of questions here beside me that have been coming in. I want to make sure that while we have you here, that we also get the opportunity to read them. This is kind of a technical question, perhaps, Craig, and it goes into a couple of different things, and it has to do with this timeline. It appears in the ordinance that there's a mechanism of the property changes, maybe within, changes double changes in a short period of time. Property transfers to an estate and then transfers again to an end user, that the same inspection process can be used or could be looked at. Is that accurate or inaccurate? Or if there's a multiple close, will it create a multiple inspection process?
I don't believe you're actually changing title when you're in the estate portion. So for instance, and you guys know this better than I do, your parents pass, you inherit the home. Basically, you're the estate of, nothing's changed hands on that. Now, when you go to sell it to somebody, you now are acting as the agent of the estate, whoever is, and this is all legal stuff. So again, not a elder care attorney. So this transfer of ownership is going to happen once. If there's a three-way where I'm selling it to you and you're selling it to Stan the next day, that typically means there's going to need to be 2 CCOs. If there's that type of circumstance, if there's going to be a title directly to you and then to Stanley. Now, would we ever know about that? Probably not. We're not going to know about that. All we need to know is that when it went to final ending at the end of that closing, that there's a CCO for that.
Yeah. So I think the takeaway there, right, is that if you're working with investors who are going to buy and flip the house, it's going to be two takeaway. It's going to be two different CEO processes, right? They may do an affidavit on the front end, say they take full responsibility, and then do a full CO on the tail end. Or they may do a CO on the front end, another CO on the end that verifies anything. Is the same thing. So one of the questions we had was, you know, what if somebody is renting a property or leasing a property and then they want to buy the property? Well, if they want to buy the property and not move out, then the seller, all of the repairs, one way or the other, are going to have to be fixed prior to the title transferring hands. It becomes kind of a matter of common sense in how it applies. It sounds like the real takeaway is every time title legally transfers, this process needs to be gone through. Even if it was done 3 days ago, whether it was done 3 days ago or 3 years ago, the process still needs to go through. Is that correct?
You would have to check with your attorney, but yes, I would interpret it that way.
Well, if it legally transitions homes, if the title legally transitions, if it transitioned 5 days ago and I flip it around, sell it again 5 days later, it's got to go back through the process again.
One of the purposes behind that section was in reference to private sales.
Yeah.
So for instance, you own a property, the deed remains in your name. You hold the contract and you sell it to somebody else. That's still a transfer of title. So that needs to be incorporated in that. We found properties in Toms River that have had 4 different owners before the deed is ever changed. So that needs to occur so that we're seeing these houses, making sure that they meet the criteria or they're taking the exception.
All right, well, I see our clock that we've come right up on the edge of our boundary line. Let me give you each one last opportunity. Jim, what comments do you have you'd like to make before we close out here today?
Well, I think that this has been very helpful and I appreciate everyone's time. And I think we're going to have some more questions that we're going to need to ask, as Brian keeps saying, behind the scenes. So let's address those and go forward.
Jeanette?
I think that with anything, we can do it. We just have to be clear with our questions and follow the rules as we find them. And I'm willing to help with the bank-owned stuff if you need help with that.
Mike?
Yeah, we're all boots on the grounds here, and obviously as realtors handling most of the sales in the area, and here to help the township any way we can, make this smooth and the clients. I just had one quick question, if you don't mind, is for the fire certification, is the one application going to also trigger that inspection, or is that a totally separate call application to the fire commissioner?
Fortunately or unfortunately, there are 2 government agencies, 2 completely separate government agencies. Both are in the same building, but one is a municipality within a municipality. So we don't have control, nor do we get to dictate to the fire service what they accept, how they accept it. Would we welcome a collaboration? By all means.
Okay, thank you.
And one,
Yeah, I think that goes the same, by the way, if, if you have a property that has a Toms River address, but you're it's in a non-incorporated area, something like that, you fall under that property falls under the auspices of who the governing authority, governing municipality is of that particular property. Jim, your final word, go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a question, clarification, actually, Craig, based on an earlier conversation with you. If we have a CO application that's been submitted and the CO inspection is done and the transaction falls through and there's a new buyer, does that CO remain valid?
For 6
Yes.
months.
That's gonna remain for 6 months.
All right, thank you.
Stan, do you have any closing comments or statements you'd like to make? Anything?
I'm just looking forward to everything taking place and working with everybody and having a smooth transition, transparent process. That's all I have.
And Craig, yourself?
We have, and other people noted earlier, and I know Jim had heard it, but we have changed things in the rental industry. We know there's going to be a learning curve. We know that this isn't daily routine for us as of yet, nor is it for you. We want to do everything we can, continued venues such as this, in-person venues, anything we want you us to do. We're going to try to make this happen smoothly so that everybody's as educated as possible. We are going to be very considerate of the circumstances on each. We've made the transition to from our more stringent or more interpreted rental COs 5 years ago. Everybody thought the sky was going to fall. A month later, it was like nothing ever happened. So we intend to handle it internally the same exact way. We want to work with the professionals. That's why we reached out. We're also meeting and presenting to the Bar Association, the Ocean County Bar Association. So we want everybody to have a clear understanding on this and make it the best thing for the residents of Township.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank Lauren San Nicolas, who's our Director of Engagement, who behind the scenes made sure everybody was able to come communicate and coordinated that for us. She does an amazing job. Again, those of you participating in the webinar, you'll be sent a link that has a survey on it. That survey gives you opportunity to ask some more questions, give some feedbacks. You can look to the website, monmouthOceanRealtors.com. It'll have some information about this and some links to the city as well. We'll continue to work with our partners at the New Jersey Realtors and trying to just to bring some clarity around some of the issues that they have inside of this ordinance, but politely and tactfully we'll work on those as well. And if we can serve you any way whatsoever, feel welcome to contact us here at the association office. We're here for you. With that being said, I would thank each and every one of you and adjourn this panel that we've had today.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.